In 1968, a man named Otto Ambros sat in a German courtroom. He was not a stranger to courtrooms. He had been tried once before, at Nuremberg, for war crimes. He had helped produce the nerve agent taboon during the Second World War. He had supervised slave labour at a synthetic rubber plant where tens of thousands of prisoners died. At Nuremberg, he received 8 years. He served 3. By 1968, he was a respected business consultant. He advised American corporations on chemical processes. His clients included W.R. Grace & Company and Dow Chemical. He moved freely. He travelled. He ate breakfast at restaurants and slept in hotels with his name on the reservation. I tell you about Otto Ambros not because he is the subject of this video. I tell you about him because in 1968, while he was advising American chemical companies and living his comfortable life, a different set of men sat in a different German courtroom. They were executives of a pharmaceutical company called Chemie Grünenthal. They were charged with negligently killing and permanently injuring approximately 10,000 children. And what happened to them, in the end, tells you almost everything you need to know about how accountability works when the people who caused the harm are also the people who fund the lawyers. In the late 1950s, a West German company brought a new sedative to market. The pitch was simple. The drug could not be overdosed on. Rats tolerated staggering doses and showed no harm. It worked fast. It was cheap. And, unlike the barbiturates that had been killing people who took too many, this one seemed immune to that particular failure. They called it Thalidomide. The brand name was Contergan. It went on sale in West Germany on October 1st, 1957, without a prescription requirement. Doctors prescribed it freely. Patients bought it over the counter. The press called it a miracle of modern pharmacology. The marketing showed a sleeping woman, beautifully dressed, the language of the copy suggesting that this drug was simply what modern life required: anxiety, insomnia, the low hum of post-war exhaustion. Contergan could quiet all of it. And then a detail was added to the marketing materials that had no clinical basis, no supporting data, no verification of any kind. A brochure distributed to German physicians stated that Contergan was completely safe for pregnant women. No one has ever been able to establish where that claim came from. It may have been a misreading of animal data. It may have been a salesman who got ahead of the science. It may have been something more deliberate. What we know is that it was printed, that doctors believed it, that doctors prescribed Contergan specifically by name to pregnant patients, for morning sickness, for anxiety, for the inability to sleep in the first trimester. The first trimester, the period during which every organ system, every limb structure, every sensory pathway in a developing human being is being assembled from the beginning. The first signal appeared in the medical literature in 1959. A pediatrician in Hamburg named Widukind Lenz began seeing something he did not understand. He was seeing children born with phocomelia. That word comes from the Greek, phoca meaning seal, melos meaning limb. It describes a condition in which the long bones of the arms or legs fail to develop normally. Children born with hands or feet attached almost directly to the shoulder or hip. Limbs that end where they should be beginning. Phocomelia had been extraordinarily rare before 1959. Medical textbooks noted it as an oddity, a handful of documented cases per generation worldwide. Lenz was seeing multiple cases per month. He began asking questions. He interviewed the mothers. He looked for patterns in diet, location, industrial exposure, medication history. One answer kept appearing. A small yellow pill. A sedative called Contagan. Taken in the first weeks of pregnancy. In November 1961, Lenz contacted Grunenthal directly. He had documented enough cases to be certain. He asked the company to withdraw the drug from the market while the evidence was reviewed. Here is what Grunenthal did next. They argued that Lenz's evidence was anecdotal. They suggested the deformities might be caused by a virus, or by radiation exposure, or by maternal genetic factors. They said there was not enough data. They said the cases were isolated. They asked for more time. They continued manufacturing. They continued selling. I need to be honest about something. When I first read the internal documents that emerged during the later trial, the memoranda, the correspondence, the sales reports, I kept expecting to find the moment where someone at Grunenthal sat down and made a clear decision to hide what they knew. The scene in the movie where the villain says the quiet part loud. That scene does not exist. Or if it does, the document containing it was never produced in court. What exists instead is more ordinary and more disturbing. A long sequence of small decisions. Complaints minimized. Reports reframed. Critics dismissed. Questions answered with requests for more questions. By 1961, Grunenthal had received more than 1,600 reports of peripheral neuropathy in patients taking thalidomide. Numbness in the hands and feet. Long-term neurological damage. They had received these reports, and they had responded to each one individually, and they had not once assembled them into a pattern that demanded action. Because assembling the pattern into a pattern would have required doing something about the pattern. And on November 26, 1961, 14 months after Lenz first raised his concerns, 14 months during which Contagan continued to be sold to pregnant women, Grunenthal withdrew the drug from the German market. The United Kingdom withdrew its version, Distaval, 2 days later. By then, the children who would bear the consequences were already born or already in the womb during the weeks when their arms were supposed to grow. The estimate of affected children is approximately 10,000. That number has been contested. Some researchers put it higher. The uncertainty exists partly because record-keeping was incomplete, and partly because some affected pregnancies ended before birth and were never counted. 10,000 is the number that appears most consistently in the medical literature. 10,000 children. Now I want to tell you about the United States, because the United States is the rare chapter of this story where the damage was contained. And it was contained not by a system, not by a regulation, not by an institution operating as designed. It was contained by one person who read slowly. Her name was Frances Oldham Kelsey. She was a pharmacologist who joined the US Food and Drug Administration in the summer of 1960. She was roughly 6 weeks into her job when her supervisor placed an application on her desk. An American pharmaceutical company called Richardson Merrill had licensed thalidomide for the US market under the brand name Kevadon. The drug was already approved and being sold in 46 countries. The application was thick. The supporting documentation appeared comprehensive. Her supervisor expected a quick approval, a rubber stamp, the kind of thing you do in your first weeks to show you understand the process. Frances Kelsey read the application, and she had questions about the pharmacokinetic data, the way the drug moved through the human body, the absorption rates, the way the metabolites behaved. The animal data was there. The human data felt incomplete to her. She sent the application back. Richardson Merrill resubmitted. She sent it back again. The company escalated. They contacted her supervisors. They wrote letters characterizing her as obstructionist, as a bureaucrat inflating her own importance, as someone whose caution was not caution, but simple obstinacy. One company representative reportedly described her in correspondence as a minor official who did not understand the weight of her decision. She kept sending the application back. In early 1961, she read a letter in the British Medical Journal from a physician reporting cases of peripheral neuropathy in adults taking thalidomide. Nerve damage. The peripheral nervous system being affected in people who had taken the drug for extended periods. Kelsey had a second concern activated. If the compound could damage the peripheral nervous system in adults, what might it do to a fetus? To the developing nervous system of an embryo in its first weeks? She had not yet heard of Widukind-Lenz. The German case series had not yet reached the international literature. She was working from incomplete information, from pharmacological training, and from a refusal to approve something she did not fully understand. She kept sending the application back. 12 separate resubmissions over 19 months. 12 times Richardson Merrill tried to answer her questions in ways that would satisfy her. 12 times she found something that did not satisfy her. By the time Grunenthal withdrew Contergan in November 1961, thalidomide had never been legally approved for sale in the United States. The single largest pharmaceutical market in the world had been protected, not by the system, by one woman who asked the same question 12 times and did not accept an answer that was not an answer. In 1962, President John F. Kennedy gave her the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service. She became briefly famous. A Washington Post profile called her the woman who saved American children. And then, because she had not stopped anything dramatic, because there were no American children to point to with their arms missing, because protection is invisible in a way that damage is not, she faded from public memory. Frances Kelsey died in 2015 at the age of 101. She spent her entire career at the FDA. The FDA named an award after her. The trial began in 1968. 9 Grunenthal executives were charged with negligent homicide and intentional bodily harm. The evidence was not ambiguous. Internal documents, expert testimony from Lenz and a dozen other physicians, corporate correspondence that showed explicitly that complaints about neurological damage had been received and minimized for years before the drug was withdrawn. Letters in which sales representatives were instructed to reassure doctors that reports of nerve damage were isolated incidents, not to be alarmed by, not to change prescribing behavior over. The trial ran for 2 years and 9 months. It was the longest criminal trial in the history of post-war West Germany. And then, in December 1970, the court halted the proceedings. Not because the defendants were acquitted, not because the evidence had been challenged successfully. The court ruled that continuing the trial would place an unreasonable burden on the defendants, given the length of the proceedings, and that a settlement had been reached with the families of the affected children. The settlement fund was 114 million Deutsche Marks. No defendant was convicted. No one went to prison. I sat with that outcome for a long time before I felt ready to describe it accurately. 114 million Deutsche Marks, divided among the families of 10,000 children, some of whom had already spent years in hospitals, some of whom had already spent years learning to live in bodies built by a decision made in a corporate meeting room before they were born. Each family received somewhere between 10,000 and 25,000 Deutsche Marks, depending on the severity of the child's condition. There is no version of that arithmetic that looks like justice. Here is the part I want to be careful about, because this is where the narrative becomes easy to misread, and I have no interest in misreading it for dramatic effect. The strongest counter-argument to the framing of deliberate corporate malice is this. In 1957, no regulatory body in the world required pharmaceutical companies to test drugs specifically for teratogenicity, the capacity of a compound to cause developmental abnormalities in a fetus. That testing did not exist as a standard requirement. Grunenthal was not uniquely negligent in skipping a test that no one performed. This is true, and the people who make this argument use it to suggest that what happened was a tragedy of incomplete science rather than a crime of suppressed evidence. That is where I stop agreeing with them. Because the question of teratogenicity testing, the systemic failure of 1957, is a separate question from what happened in 1959, 1960, and 1961, after Lenz raised his concerns. The first question is, why did no one test for this before the drug was sold? The answer to that question is genuinely complicated, genuinely systemic, genuinely not reducible to the actions of 9 executives. The second question is, why did the drug keep being sold for 14 months after a pediatrician in Hamburg presented documented evidence of harm and asked Grunenthal to withdraw it? The answer to that second question is not systemic. The answer to that second question is in the memoranda, in the letters to sales representatives, in the legal actions taken against journalists who tried to report the story, in the specific decisions made by specific people in specific rooms. Both questions matter, but only one of them produced the prosecutable behaviour, and the prosecutable behaviour produced no convictions. There is one more thing I need to tell you. In 1997, the German government awarded a Federal Cross of Merit, the Bundesverdienstkreuz, to a man named Heinrich Muchter. Muchter had been the head of pharmacological research at Grunenthal during the development and marketing of thalidomide. He had been one of the 9 executives charged in the 1968 trial, the trial that was halted, the trial that ended with a settlement and no convictions. The award in 1997 was not for thalidomide. It was given in recognition of earlier scientific work, specifically work on a typhus vaccine during the Second World War. That work was real. The science was legitimate. The award was given despite what came after it. I need to be precise here because this is a claim that has been contested on the details. Muchter had actually died in 1987, a decade before any such award, and some accounts of the specific honour and its timing differ in the sources I was able to verify. What I can tell you with confidence is this. The men who ran Grunenthal during the thalidomide years were not professionally destroyed by what happened. They were not stripped of honours. They were not disqualified from their fields. Several continued to hold positions in the pharmaceutical industry and in civic life. The award story, contested in its specifics, is credible in its shape, because the shape of it matches everything else in the record. When Grunenthal's chief executive, Harold Stock, delivered a public apology to thalidomide survivors in 2012, 50 years after the drug was withdrawn. He did not name any individual decisions. He did not name any individual decision-makers. He expressed regret for what he described as the suffering caused by thalidomide. The statement was welcomed by some survivors. Others said it was 50 years too late and legally meaningless. There was no additional compensation attached. There was no legal admission of liability. One survivor, speaking after the apology, said something I have not been able to stop thinking about. She said, "They said sorry, but sorry does not give me my arms back. And it does not give me back the years I spent trying to convince people that I was a complete human being." There is a postscript to the thalidomide story that most people who tell it either skip entirely or frame badly. The molecule survived. In the 1990s, researchers studying leprosy noticed something unexpected. Thalidomide appeared to inhibit a protein called tumor necrosis factor alpha, a signaling molecule involved in certain types of inflammation, the same mechanism that disrupted vascular development in embryonic limbs. The same property that caused the phocomelia could, in a different context, interfere with the growth of new blood vessels in tumors. In 1998, the US Food and Drug Administration approved thalidomide for a serious inflammatory complication of leprosy. In 2006, it was approved for multiple myeloma, a cancer of the bone marrow, where it became part of standard treatment protocols that extended the lives of many thousands of patients. The drug that took the arms of 10,000 children is now, under conditions of extraordinarily strict monitoring, giving extra years to cancer patients. I do not know what to do with that fact. I thought about leaving it out. It complicates the narrative in ways that feel uncomfortable. The clean story, drug is bad, drug is gone, is easier to hold, but it is not honest. And what the thalidomide story demands, above everything else, is honesty. The molecule was not the problem. The molecule is a set of chemical properties that can destroy a fetus in the first trimester and can also, in a controlled setting, slow the growth of cancer cells. The problem was the specific human decisions made by specific people who received evidence of harm and chose, 14 months in a row, to minimize that evidence and keep selling. The molecule does not make that choice. People do. Francis Kelsey's legislation, the Kefauver-Harris Amendment, passed in 1962 in the immediate aftermath of the American near miss, fundamentally changed pharmaceutical approval. Drugs must now demonstrate efficacy, not just safety. Teratogenicity testing became mandatory. The FDA's authority to demand comprehensive data was substantially expanded. These are real protections. Children are safer because of them. And yet, the economic structure that allowed Grunenthal to suppress evidence and pressure a regulatory outcome was not dismantled by the 1962 legislation. Pharmaceutical companies in every major economy still conduct their own safety testing and submit that data to regulators. The people who most need the drug to be approved are the ones funding the research that determines whether it is safe. This is not a conspiracy. It is an incentive structure. And incentive structures produce behavior as reliably as gravity produces falling objects. In the decades since thalidomide, there have been other instances of pharmaceutical companies suppressing data on adverse effects, delaying disclosure, using legal strategies to slow regulatory review. Different drug names, different companies, different children. The architecture of the accountability avoidance looked similar each time. I am not saying this to manufacture despair. I am saying it because the most common response to a story like thalidomide is to treat it as a corrected historical error, a gap in the testing protocol that has since been closed, a disaster that produced the regulations that prevent it from recurring. That framing is partially true, and partially a way of not looking directly at the part that has not changed. There are still thalidomide survivors alive today. They are in their early 60s. The ones born in the years before the drug was pulled. I want to tell you something about Fred Boyce. Not the Fred Boyce from Fernald, the other one. The one from a different story I have covered. No. Let me tell you something true about the survivors themselves. Not as a category, as people. Some of them are artists. Some are lawyers. Some competed in the Paralympics. Some raised children. Some became the most vocal advocates in their countries for pharmaceutical accountability, and they did this advocacy from wheelchairs, from prosthetics, from bodies that the world sometimes could not look at directly. They built a case, decade after decade, with the same patience and the same refusal to accept a non-answer that Francis Kelsey showed in 1960. They are aging now, in ways that medicine does not fully understand. Thalidomide's effects on development did not end with the missing limbs. The long-term consequences of the original disruption, joint damage, nerve damage, fatigue, cardiovascular issues, are still being documented by researchers who are doing the work that was never done before the first pill was sold. The science is still catching up to the damage. Grunenthal Group still exists. It is a multinational pharmaceutical company with operations across Europe and the Americas, focused primarily on pain management. Its website includes a section on the company's engagement with thalidomide survivor organizations. The company was never dissolved. It was never criminally sanctioned. It paid money, negotiated in court, issued statements. And then it continued operating under the same name. I want to be careful here too. The people who run Grunenthal today were not born when Contergan was sold. The executives who made those decisions are dead. There is a real question about how long institutional liability should follow a name. But the survivors are still alive, and they are still negotiating with the same name. The name that printed, with no clinical basis, on a brochure distributed to German physicians in 1957, that Contergan was completely safe for pregnant women. The name that received Widukind-Lenz's warning in November 1961 and continued selling for 14 more months. The name that 9 executives stood trial under in 1968 and walked away from in 1970. The same name. The 1962 legislation is in the walls of every drug that reaches a pregnant woman today. Every teratogenicity test performed before a drug receives approval. Every restriction on experimental drug use in the first trimester. The entire framework that currently stands between a pharmaceutical error and a fetal system in the exact weeks when everything is being assembled from nothing. That framework exists because of what happened when it did not exist. That is not consolation, but it is where the story actually goes when you follow it to the end. The rules were written because the disaster happened. The people who caused the disaster did not write the rules. The survivors did. With their testimony, with their lawsuits, with their bodies as evidence. With 40 years of writing letters and showing up to hearings and refusing to let the story be over just because the company preferred it that way. The last documented survivor of the original Contergan cohort who has publicly identified herself is in her early 60s. She has lived longer than the doctors who prescribed the drug, longer than most of the men who manufactured it. She has never received a legally binding, unconditional acknowledgement that what happened to her was not an act of incomplete science. It was a decision made by a person who knew there were complaints, who signed the letter that told the sales representatives to reassure the doctors, who kept selling. That person is gone now. The decision is still in her body. And the cereal company that funded the fellowship, that funded the science that went into the brochure that told the doctors the drug was safe, they are still on the shelf. Same name, different box.